everyone. I'm Dennis Sikowski, Science Director here at Hudson River Foundation. I just want to welcome all of you that are here with us in our office and welcome all of you that are on the webinar today. For those of you on the webinar and haven't participated before, hopefully you can see us and you can hear us. We won't be able to see or hear you, but we will be able to take your questions later on. And if you can look on your screen, you can see there's a spot where you can write, you can type in some questions, and we will be happy to take those at the end of David's talk. Today we're going to hear about one of our favorite, or Dave's favorite fish, at least in the world, white perch. And I have the pleasure of knowing Dave Secor for a long time, since he was a struggling graduate student in South Carolina and moved into the Chesapeake Bay. It's been a real pleasure knowing Dave and to watch his career blossom in the fisheries world. Dave is particularly interested in fish that have some recreational or commercial importance, and he's been studying their life histories and migration patterns, and trying to figure out how those things really affect the resilience of species. And we're going to hear more about that looking at striped bass in relationship to their resilience or non-resilience, I guess, to climate change issues. So it's good to have Dave back in New York. And without any further ado, Dave Secor.
Thank you, Dennis. And today I'm going to talk about, I think they can see me in Tomorrowland. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about white perch in the Hudson River. I want to acknowledge my graduate student. This is complete theft. This is his thesis project, and most of the slides are his. And this is Brian Gallagher. And Brian has another connection with the Hudson River Foundation. His current supervisor is Mary Fabrizio, who's on the foundation's board. And you recognize somebody else in the background there. That's Steve Knack, who's helped us over the years, helped us with this project as well. I want to thank the Hudson River Foundation. As Dennis, hello Clay, as Dennis mentioned, this has been as much a formative part of my career as any other group. And this marks the 25th year that we've had support from the Hudson River Foundation. And white perch is one of my favorites, but it's hard to pick favorites, you know. And one of the things that we latched on to early, in the early kind of request for proposals that we looked at, the foundation had language related to key species, I think you called them. And this idea of using key species to say something about the ecosystem health was something we really latched on to across all these species that either traverse or live their entire lives or major parts of their lives in different parts of the Hudson River. And it's been a real privilege to work in all parts of the Hudson River estuary. It really is, in my view, the most beautiful estuary in the United States. All right, so we are going to look at white perch today. And white perch is a good species, is an indicator species, because you might describe it as the most abundant, ubiquitous species in the Hudson River. It's in brackish parts of the Hudson River. It's in tidal freshwater. It's up in the tributaries. And so it is a very good indicator species, and we're certainly not the first to make note of this. It's been a focal species by folks at Carey Institute, for instance, to look at the impacts of zebra mussels, and I will be building on that story. But also, it's been heavily surveyed and reported on by the utilities in their year-class reports. If you go to these year-class reports, white perch is the most abundant thing that they're writing about. And so it's the best surveyed species in the Hudson River estuary. So it's worth taking a look at. And I want to thank also John and others who supplied us these year-class reports and helped in some of their interpretations. So the Hudson River estuary, my own Chesapeake myopic view, it's turbid like the Chesapeake, but for different reasons. It's moderately productive. Again, that's a relative thing. And it's advective. It doesn't have this kind of stratified partial mixing layer thing that we have in the Chesapeake. It's advective. It's a flume. And that means very short residence times. And then it's also been affected by this very abrupt change. Again, a focal focus of research by many investigators in the Hudson River, real kind of great case study of an abrupt ecosystem change that some people might call a regime shift in the estuary. So when you look at the Hudson River estuary, this is the big 600-pound gorilla you have to wrestle with. It's a very dynamic change, and gradient pressure, of course, had carryover knockoff effects on zooplankton stocks and size distributions, and even benthic invertebrates, like the amphipods we were talking about. So very abrupt change. And then the other thing about this, we have both abrupt things and gradual things going on in the ecosystem. The gradual part of this relates to flow. And Secor has talked about flow structuring the Hudson River ecosystem, that we have decreased light in the river at high flow, increased water clarity. We have decreased residence time when we have high flow conditions. Those are very strong relationships. And these two then contribute to this relationship between primary production and flow as being inverse. And this is a very strange concept for your cousins from the Chesapeake, because we like flow down there. Usually we have flow conditions that sets up concentration points, and we have higher production with higher flow. So it's an opposite land for us when we come off the Hudson River. And that has to do with the hydraulics of the Hudson River. So we're interested in flow because there's been this kind of long-term change. Now this, I can't tell you whether this is climate force. I'm sure it's climate force, so there's related to climate warming and global forcing. But in any case, certainly over the last couple of decades, we've had this trend of increasing freshwater flow. And as I'll talk about later, Ray Major, who does climate models, has downscale models, and projects that this freshwater flow should continue to increase in the Hudson River watershed into the coming decades. All right, so we're going to look at white perch. And the way we're going to look at this, we're going to look at white perch dynamics, the population dynamics on the entire Hudson River estuary scale. And we're going to divide this up, just like the utilities, and the utilities survey lets us do this, by life history stages. And so we have eggs, oh, there we go, eggs and larvae, and then feeding larvae that are up in fresh water. This is a so-called anadromous fish. They're getting up above the salt line, using that area as early habitats. And then they move from a pelagic-like stage to more demersal one, moving into littoral habitats during that young of the year juvenile period. And also during that period, they may be moving into brackish waters. They may be moving down estuary into those lower estuarine habitats. I'm going to talk on this point later about this branch here, where they move into brackish water. But today, for the first part of the talk, let's just talk about this entire life cycle. Did I do that? Okay, the utility survey, which is really wonderful. I mean, I just can't believe the sampling intensity for a system this size, as fine as Dennis, is truly unique. I don't know of any other estuary that's had such a long-term intensive ichthyoplankton survey for 30-plus years. Just amazing. When I have to consult on issues in the Potomac River, for instance, related to larval striped bass spawning, I have to go back to ichthyoplankton surveys that were done 25, 30 years ago. Just nothing there. And that's typical for most estuaries. So this is a real treasure trove of data. So we have a longitudinal river survey that samples the ichthyoplankton. We have utilities beach survey that samples the young and year. And then we have this fall juvenile survey that samples young and year and age 1 estuary. So we can look at all those different stages. And more than that, because this is a stratified, randomized stratified design, the utility applied statistics can construct defensible sample stock estimates. And that's a really nice thing to have. Absolute advantages rather than just relative indices. So we use their estimates of sample stock, which is available for the recent period. So we focus, in the first part of this talk, I'm going to focus on just the recent period, last 22 years, where we have use standing stock estimates, and we're just going to see what it looks like now. And then I'm going to use relative abundance indices, which correlate fairly well with the standing stock estimates, to look at before zebra mussel invasion and after zebra mussel invasion. We're going to evaluate one stage against the other. So we have stage 1, so early stage, we look at the later stage in comparison. And you might expect them to be proportional. So if you put more eggs in the system, you get more larvae. That's one premise that we're going to look for. And the other premise is that you don't always get more when you put more in the system. And you get these density-dependent responses. So this could be related to something like competition and starvation. There's not enough forage in the environment that the new stage is moving into. Or it could be related to targeted predation, get up to a certain density and predators begin to target. There's different ways you can get these health responses. So we'll be looking for both of those kinds of transitions from one stage to the next. So this is the recent period after zebra mussel invasion. You can see for eggs translate well from adult stock. So you have more adults, you have more eggs. You have more eggs, you have more yolk sac larvae. You have more yolk sac larvae, you have more feeding larvae. That's pretty nice. I mean, it just is, everything's proportional to each other. It's also nice because it kind of corroborates the survey itself. That's what you would hope to find. You know, what would you do if you had an inverse relationship? You'd probably publish a paper and say that was really interesting, but you might be suspicious about the survey. So these are nice things to see. Now, we're going to move next to this kind of feeding larval stage. And again, they're up in the pelagic, and then they're moving into littoral habitats. So when you do that, you get this dome response. So now we're seeing density dependence coming into play. So this we would call kind of a population bottleneck. That things are limited in terms of what's passed through this stage. All right? Now, we can also bring in as a separate parameter flow. And when we do that, we get this jagged. That's the model with flow in it. You see, it still has this overall plump pattern. But now we're explaining the positive and the negative residuals. When you have positive residuals, those are years of low flow. And when you have those less than expected negative residuals, those are years of high flow. So we're explaining a lot in the recent period. We're saying that during this transition from the pelagic larvae to the submerged juvenile, we're getting density dependence, and we're getting the sensitivity to flow that we didn't see for the other stages. That's what they said. And so, you know, in some ways, I've really been attracted to the Hudson River. I mean, from the Chesapeake. The Chesapeake's just a mess. It's all this branching sub-estuaries. And it's so nice to come up here and just think of this linear system. But that's very naive. And where this research is taking us is that these littoral habitats are playing a very large role in the production of white perch. And this, when you look at the utilities data in terms of where juvenile concentration centers are largest, they're around tributary mouths. So we do have to think about the Hudson River a bit as a network system when we think about white perch production. I think that would be kind of the next research direction I would take this. All right, so now we're going to compare the before zebra mussel to after zebra mussel with these white history transitions. We're going to use relative indices. Now, before I get to the transition, let's just look at the overall levels of abundance. And David Strayer at Carey Institute and others have looked at similar statistics, but we keep looking at bringing in new years and slightly different statistics. So we do have some new results here. I think Dave showed that the number of the year had depressed in their abundance. That's been fairly well known. We saw that actually the eggs were down by 50%. So that suggests the eggs are down, and they're proportional to the adults. It suggests that we probably have a lower adult spawn stock out there. Younger than a year, down 40%. And also these yearlings, I think this is the first time this has been reported, they're down by 53%. Yeah?
If there's half as many eggs, why is the yolk sac larvae equivalent?
Nice. I was going to get there.
Oh.
What do you think? How would you explain that?
I would say that better hatching of the eggs since the
So if you look at the transitions, you see just that. So you get, it looks like after, which is the after is post-invasion of open guys. You see we get a higher translation of our eggs to our yolk sac larvae. So there is this kind of evidence of some compensation. So we're getting higher survival perhaps in young yolk sac larvae.
Why should that be?
Well, yes, I don't know. Could be something related to standing stocks, carrying capacity. I don't know, but it's, or maybe something related to the predator field on the yolk sac larvae. But in any case, it's one of those mathematical realities that you said. If they're staying the same and one thing's going down, that's what's going on there. We didn't see any evidence of that happening across other phases. Now, what about our dense-dependent relationship when we move from the transitional feeding larvae to the young of the year? Here, what we're looking at for the post-invasion, the pre-invasion, is the solid line. And so the solid line is telling us that overall we're getting higher juvenile production for each larvae, or each certain amount of larvae. But the other thing is when we try to put flow into the model for that relationship, it's not statistically significant. So flow only becomes significant after the zebra mussel invasion. So this is where the zebra mussel invasion led this population to be increasingly sensitive to flow. So you have this abrupt change, and you have this gradual change that now has a much bigger forcing than it did prior to invasion. We're also seeing that we have this depressed production of juvenile or age 1 fish. And this goes to the point that we may have a lower fatting stock of adults out there than we had prior to zebra mussel invasion. All right, so just some conclusions. We think that this is related to increased grazing, not affect both the zooplankton and the demersal invertebrate populations that young white perch feed upon. So this increased sensitivity to flow, and I think I've already said all those things. Now, we can look at just flow, how it's increased during the sensitive phases of the fish's life history, and here we just look at flow during the larval period. You see that it's a fairly high level, consistent level of increase, 2% per year. So this does forecast that this could become an increasing issue, and as I mentioned before, the climate projections suggest a flow increase of 10 to 15% by the year 2100. The other thing we've observed that kind of fits in with this story is that the young of the year that are using that withdrawal habitat, that they grow. This is young of the year length at a specific date in October, that their growth is inversely related to summer flow. So they all fit together. Overall conclusion is zebra mussel forced white perch production in alternate states. We can talk about not only alternate states applying to ecosystems, but also to populations of species. The population is now structured differently than it was prior to zebra mussel invasion. We have a lower spawning stock. That's a speculation, but it seems to hold in terms of depressed egg abundance, depressed yearling abundance. We see reduced juvenile production and increased sensitivity to environmental flow. As I suggested, I think this would be a fruitful area of research not only for white perch, and I think there have been past RFPs focused on the connectivity to wetlands and tributaries. Right? And it might be good to revisit that theme again in the future. Okay, the next part of this talk has also been published, and this is again led by my captain, Brian Gallagher. And this relates to a phenomenon that really emerged here in the Hudson River. A guy named John Clark first talked about this issue striped bass, not all following the same migration route. So I certainly followed up on this. This is called partial migration. Just like I visited my cousins last night by Columbia University. They never left Manhattan. I did. We're the same family. That's partial migration. Right? It's like having, and you can see this kind of yin and yang within families, within populations of species. And I think it's a dominant mode, it's a dominant way we should think about how and why and migration evolves and how it plays out, partial migration phenomenon. And I wrote a whole book about it, so I'm kind of fixated on this concept. And white perch, the reason I had such an affection for white perch is they were my model species for looking at this. Striped bass was just too flexible, and white perch had these kind of nice modes and complete their life cycle within the estuary and have to leave and go up to Cape Cod or something. Like striped bass do. All right, so now we return to this figure, and now we're going to spend some time talking about these alternative pathways. Either you stay in freshwater or you move into brackish water. And what's interesting, of course, is that these environments are very different in the Hudson River. You know, you think about Newburgh Bay and Haverstraw and those kinds of environments. You think about up like Catskill and Saugerties, those kinds of environments. They're very different, very different. Think about the littoral, shallow water habitats in Haverstraw, the sheer area of that compared to those types of habitats in freshwater portion. And so you have a population that sees both of these kinds of habitats. And if there are deliberate behaviors that underlay how it sees those different habitats, that may contribute to this idea of how we make this population more resilient to things like flow and so we are going to look at whether fish stay within fresh water after they're born, or whether they move into brackish water by looking at otoliths or earstones. And earstones have these ring-like features which relate to daily age, these larvae and juveniles, these daily rings. This is like the otolith one. Fish is a yolk sac larvae, and we can go out for scores of increments and figure out the age of juvenile or larval fish. And then we can also take the otoliths of adults, and this will be a much larger otolith, and these are cross-sections. So this is like taking a section to an onion, so they're sewing. And you can see these yearly rings, so we can get those. The other thing about otoliths is they're calcium carbonate. They get contaminated by certain elements. The element that we're interested in, Hudson, strontium, and the strontium-calcium ratio in the Hudson relates to salinity gradient. We've had Karen Lindbergh here talking recently, you know, all about this ad nauseum. So in any case, we use a microprobe technique. This is what folks look at. It's a very old technique, so people look at moon rocks that want to use up on a Mars lander. And so we can measure very small areas across the otolith surface, the section surface, and construct what the strontium was in fish with the larvae, what it was when it was a juvenile, and then on out when it was an adult. And that tells us the salinity habitat that those fish saw on an individual basis. All right, so these plots, here's total length. And so right here, about 20, 25 millimeters, that's that transition from the larval period to the juvenile period. And then we have strontium calcium, so we're higher than this line. We're in brackish water. We're lower than the line, we're in freshwater. And so you see here plotted is that there's some juveniles, which we spent some time with Steve Mack collecting in many parts of the River. You say these juveniles are staying in freshwater. And another group are transitioning into brackish water, right, as during the late larval, early juvenile period. That's for 1 year. You look at the other year, you see some evidence of early dispersal and more distributed dispersal. So it happens in different ways in different years, but it's happening over that early life history stage. The interesting question now is, why does this matter? So what questions did you ask if it mattered? What happens to the fish that move into brackish water? What happens to the fish that move into freshwater? So we'll look at that a little bit. We're going to look at that by looking at the adult otoliths. So we're going to query the otoliths, the adults first, by looking at the first year of their life and saying, okay, when you were a juvenile, where did you spend your life? Were you in freshwater, brackish water? And then we can even carry this further out and can say, okay, we know where you were when you were a juvenile. Did you stay there as an adult, or did you move back? So that latter question is shown here. It's kind of involved process or sample size aren't very large. But in any case, when we collect adults in the fall and we capture them in freshwater and we query them, they're in freshwater as juveniles and they're in freshwater as adults. So there's a very strong carryover effect. If you're a juvenile and you go to freshwater, you're going to be an adult in freshwater. And the same thing pretty much applies in brackish water. Some exceptions with small sample sizes. That's the first. Why does that matter? Whether we split this population of freshwater and brackish water. Oh, well, I don't know. Let me go to that first. It matters because they grow at very different rates. They don't look very different, but they're very different. And we would predict, for instance, that a white perch would mature 1 year earlier in brackish water than in freshwater. And that sets up very different dynamics. Generation time is lower. Turnover is higher in brackish water than freshwater. And that fits in a lot with other research that shows higher growth rates in brackish water than in freshwater. Well, why doesn't everything move into brackish water? It's so great down there. And I go back to this. Well, we think that the survivorship is much less there. In our juvenile samples, and we don't know if we got a representative sample, we sampled throughout the Hudson River estuary, down to Ames Seminar. We saw fairly equivalent numbers of juveniles that moved into brackish and freshwater. When we look at the adult sample, we see very few fish that are from brackish water. And the way we do this is we query the adult again. Where were you during your first year of life? And then we age the adult. We say, okay, what year were you born? That's called year class. And so we have all these year classes. This is when our sample was born. And then for each year class, we can say, okay, were you born in freshwater, were you born in brackish water? And over all the year classes, we see that brackish behavior seems to be a minority behavior. And the freshwater part of the population is dominating, at least in terms of this evidence, its contribution to the spawning stock. These are all spring samples. Does everybody follow that? Yeah, we didn't see that in the Chesapeake. It varies system by system, with the Tuxant, the brackish water dominating. And so this is kind of an interesting dynamic, and if we went back in time, maybe we would find there were decades where the brackish water was more productive than the fresh water. All right, so carryover effect, miners likely to mature fast, spawn more eggs. In summary, we found two contingents, so a faster growth, larger maximum size. That's another interesting thing. When we started this captive saying, just tell me why these white perch are so stunted. You know, when you go to the Chesapeake, you have nice big, white perch is a humble fish. It's not the strength basses, but we have much bigger white perch. And so there does seem to be, and so are they dying when they turn 3? No, they're just growing more slowly. That's the answer to that. Still we get pretty good longevity. Look at that, out to 12. But that's still a pretty small fish, especially by Chesapeake Bay standards. Do you see them bigger down by you? Or where you were before, Judy?
In Hackensack? No.
Getting bigger, yes.
Whatever.
Somewhere, certainly well over 200.
Yeah.
I'm just, can you say that predation is higher on them
I can't.
down in the more saline part?
I have to rely on my colleague, Karin Lindberg, who erected this hypothesis. It was kind of a predatory gauntlet, and she did this for a locia for shads, based on this same kind of proportional look, that when you looked at shad as they're moving through, there were higher proportion coming through and that were brackish, but when they came back, they didn't see it. And she inferred that it was related to food fish, maybe striped bass fish. those abundances of those predators are higher in brackish water than they are in fresh water. So that's the idea. We don't have any direct proof of it.
Because there's better food down there.
I know.
And they're growing better.
Yeah. We also saw higher mortality rates for our eel work, which we did catch curve analysis, and that was very demonstrable. We saw higher mortality rates for eels in brackish water than those are yellow eels. So there may be some you think that the suite of marine predators that come into the lower estuaries is pretty substantial. All right, I'm done with that story. Any questions about white perch? We're going to continue some of it. This idea of looking at, you know, if you've had a higher proportion of brackish, if you had environmental forcing on one part, like zebra mussels having a bigger impact on the forage phase, on freshwater, on brackish water, you can play these kinds of scenarios out in a structured model, and that's our next step, is to play those what-if games and see how this population structure is supported. I suspect it could be quite important in terms of this bottleneck of littoral habitat between the pelagic and the juvenile period, because you see so much more littoral habitats in even brackish areas.
I'm just going back to amphipods.
Yeah.
Is it possible that they're growing better in the brackish area because there's better populations of amphipods to eat than in freshwater?
Yeah.
I would think.
Also, just the aerial extent of shallow waters. It's not just, you know, marsh littorals. It's shallow turbid waters is where we find white perch. And the extent of that is so much larger.
Is it possible that our Hudson River is just evolutionary anomalous compared to the standard coastal environment the species comes from, where you've got a very long estuary, and that normally the separation distance between blackfish and fresh isn't this kind of distance, isn't this one-way trip. And maybe, you know, what works perfectly well anywhere else on the East Coast just doesn't work on the Hudson.
Yeah, I don't know, but the thing about white perch is they are everywhere. So you can go down to Long Island and visit their creeks. My person is looking at this on where it has. You have probably self-reproducing populations in those tidal creeks. So they are very much kind of colonizing species. You find them in lakes. So I think that they will make way. And part of the way that they colonize, and every fish colonizes, relates to this partial migration. That's a very important mechanism that allows fish to get new latch holes in new environments. And we talk about new environments, we're creating new environments, climate change. So these colonization things are not like fish moving into vacuums, fish adapting to new environments. You can consider that as colonization behavior. All right. Any other questions?
I have one. Could you tell me who did the longitudinal net surveys?
Well, this is Con Ed, but
They were in charge of it?
Most of these online until recently, year after year.
Up
Tremendous effort.
Up in Haverstraw, we have an outfit that does net surveys, and I'm just wondering if that was the one, because I'm up there.
I think that's, so I don't know, what kind of net do you see? Is it square frame kind of thing?
I guess they use typical.
Internet.
No, they may, but I was thinking of the board, you know, for catching fish. You know, these big boards.
Oh, the others. Yeah, I don't know if that's been done regularly. That may just be a target.
I'll go and ask you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Maybe it's a legal issue. In any case, let me, if I have some time with your indulgence, I'd like to talk a little bit about our current project, which is on spawning behavior and ocean migration from the Hudson River striped bass. And this is work that I'm doing in collaboration with New York State, DEC, now Amanda Hayes. We initiated this project through cooperations with Kathy and Paula. It's been really great working with the state in terms of partnering on this project. So this is Newburgh Bay. I'm looking south. And this is one of the areas that striped bass have been known to spawn in. But in big rivers, like the Hudson, the Potomac, St. John's, and Canadian systems, you find that striped bass don't, the dogger's, they move above the salt front, they drop their eggs, and the salt front retains those water eggs early in life. But there are other striped bass. The Potomac go in the Anacostia, keep striped bass spawning out there. And we have striped bass in the Hudson that go all the way up to Albany. And so I remember Dennis Canley, University striped bass days, talking about this behavior. Nobody's really investigating. So I thought, well, maybe salmon. Why not? And salmon have these beautiful spawning runs. They come in at different times, and that's related to where they spawn. So the sockeye comes in one time and it's destined for a lake, and another one comes in another time that's destined for some montane stream. Could we see the same kind of thing in striped bass? We had some indications from our own research. This is early telemetry work published in Transactions 2007, and we followed a group of resident striped bass, fish that we tagged in the fall up in the upper part of the Hudson River estuary. And it's hard to do with a pointer, but this part of it, they're moving from down estuary to up estuary. These lines are where we have receivers, the dashed one. If you look at the top, you see that one's going up in spring, and it's going all the way up to Albany. We have a series that are going up to Albany, and we get down here, and then we have a series that are going up to the Catskill. And then you go down here, and we have some that are looking like they're going to the Newburgh Bay area. And other people have discussed this kind of behavior as well. So we want to see if this is kind of repeatable behavior. This shows modalities in where they spawn. We have some other indications which are kind of interesting about modes, locations of spawning. This is from the longitudinal survey again, which the gift that keeps on giving. And you can see that in terms of, these are egg densities, fractions of annual egg density. And in the early period from 1988 through 96, you see that it's skewed towards Catskill Sawreeds area spawning. But in more recent periods, more equitably distributed between Newburgh Bay, parts a little bit south towards the Highlands, and then up towards Catskill Sawreeds area. So that's kind of interesting. Are there underlying spawning run behaviors associated with this? So this is just a real pleasure. I have been on the river a lot. I've seen the Holocene operated from afar, and this time we got together and watered it ourselves. And what a treat. I was like, I was daydreaming, saying, I got to retire up there and go out with these guys. It's just so much fun. I'm sure it's very hard work. I probably have a heart attack next year every day. But these are really cool operations. Anybody seen this operation? Yeah, it's a cool thing. I mean, they had a caravan of trucks, boats. They'd usually get 3 or 4 boats out there. A crew of 10 just to haul the 500-foot Holocene men deployed by boats. It's a cool operation. They got portable tables they set out, measuring boards. Everything is smooth. So, because they've been doing it for quite a while, they have a really nice, dedicated young group of folks doing this work. So it's really fun. I would encourage it should be on all your bucket lists. And I think they like volunteers out there. In any case, the other nice thing about it is that they come up with very good condition spawning adult, large adult striped bass, which we think are the ones that migrate to the oceanic waters in the pens. And then they also not only help get us the fish, but cooperatively tag this fish. And we're tagging these fish with pingers about the size of my thumb, acoustic pingers, and these are coded so we know the individual fish that was tagged. And this is a system of easy pass. The fish moves past a receiver we put out in the river or the ocean. There passes within 500 to 1,000 kilometers. The receiver detects the fish, logs its identification, and the date and time it hears it, just like easy pass. Oh, it's really great. Boy, the Hudson River is really well instrumented with receivers. These all one receiver, a little skin in the game, down by what is that? Cornwall and Hudson. In any case, here's Albany's up the top, and now that pink area is the Catskill Sawdry, or Sawdry's Catskill area. And you can see how many receivers, one every, I don't know, less than a kilometer through that area. And then it's a little bit more dispersed as you move down towards towards the Newburgh Bay area here. And they continue on. So it's really a great time to do these kinds of electronic guiding studies. One of the objectives we had in this study is we had tagged in a previously supported project by the Foundation 15 of these large oceanic fish. And within the first 2 months, we lost 35%. That's a lot of fishing mortality. You know that there's a big fishery on the spawners in the Hudson River, in the desert target. And that may be a bit too high. And so we wanted to look at that through telemetry. So we can calculate how many fish are lost because we're hearing them as they move past the easy pass. If we lose one, then we can say that that's lost mortality. And the presumption then is it's not natural mortality, it's fishing mortality. Well, with 100 fish that we tagged, distributed both in the Catskill area and the Newburgh Bay area, we feel much better about that. It's 24% in 2016. One of the things that also biases these is that you have different partners providing us data for these receivers, and some of that data kind of trickles in over time. So we like to give enough time for that data to trickle in. We think for the more recent period, 2017, that we don't have the full recapture data, and that's why this is higher. As we get the recapture data, then we heard Sam, so we can add him and Sally and so on. So that is probably going to be, that's quite a little higher than we had in 2016, it seems like. But this will be useful for DC and assessment purposes. Okay, here's our spawning runs, and we have, this is Ukraine, we have 66 fish of the 100 fish that we tagged. That's a great return over a year after we tagged them, considering that this is a heavily fished species. So we're delighted. 66, and they're fairly, we still have fairly equal representation between our Catskill releases up estuary and our Newburgh releases down estuary. And this is for 2017. We truncated the data only to show you what's going on in the Hudson River. You notice that all these patterns have this shape. That's our spawning run. On the y-axis is latitude, so they're moving north in spring, early spring, and then they're moving south in later spring. So this is all the data we have. And now our task is to say, are there different modes of behavior in those spawning runs? So that's what we're working on right now. And we're conceiving of different statistical means and also different kind of process model means to get at that answer. Yeah.
So is the idea that it continues kind of out of the estuary at some point, like a little S curve, and then they come back and then?
Yes, it would be a big S because they're going into marine environments.
Right.
And that's the part of the story I'm not going to tell you now until you invite me back again.
Looks like more of the Newburgh ones stay up there longer. You know, there's a sort of long horizontal part.
Yeah.
Whereas it doesn't, the Catskill ones don't seem to stay up as by and large.
Right. So we get into some of them, but yeah, you're right. You could just stare at that for a while and come up with all kinds of stories. And our challenge is to draw defensible inferences on this data set. And we're having a lot of it, but nobody really has tried this before. And so the first approach is to use just a simple kind of multivariate clustering approach. So we use a K-cluster means approach. And when we do that, we get these, and this is regardless of where they're released. That's going to be a post hoc question. But initially, we just want to say, do we have these different behaviors? And it does look like we have two modal behaviors. We tested for more than two behaviors, but the test gave us two different behaviors have the highest probability of being correct. And you can see that we have one behavior that begins to approach that Catskill Sawdry's area, and another behavior that's lower down in the estuary. So this because this is kind of an agnostic, blind, statistical behavior, it's because there's some confidence that we have these underlying behaviors. But those lighter lines are individual. And you can see there's a lot of noise, variance, a lot of things for us to digest further. One of the interesting things I like is we don't know much about how the spawning run actually relates to the spawning behavior. And there are, in some telemetry work, electronic tagging work, you can get at movements. How much is a fish moving? How fast is it moving? In an hour, in a day? How directly are fish moving? We think we have enough receiver assets to ask those kinds of questions, to use some of those movement ecology tricks. And this is where Helen Bailey comes in, is collaborating on this project and tries this group. This was last year? Yeah, using these kinds of movement models to get that. So we're going to use that next. And we'll keep digesting this. The other interesting thing is for salmon, they have this overshoot behavior. I really enjoyed reading about this, but you think salmon are so precise, they're going to go right, they don't. Not at all. They go zipping right past where they're supposed to go. And they can go 10, 20, 30 miles, even more beyond that stream before they, oh, I made a mistake. And then they come back around. So there's a lot of this guess and go behavior in nature. And maybe that's what some of the high peaks are, or maybe that's we're just fine. So there's more to look at there. And we'll have this year what's going to happen in the next couple months. So we'll have that coming in as well. So big preview, spawning run mortality looks to be about 25%. We have evidence of these 2 discrete spawning runs. There's our ocean migrations. Guess what? Not only me that migrates down to Maryland, these Hudson River striped bass migrate down to Maryland. We have a large project looking at wind energy effects on migratory fish off Ocean City. And we had expected, and most of the fish we're hearing are Hudson River fish, which is really cool. We had tagged a bunch of Potomac fish. I don't know where we haven't heard it yet, but we are hearing a lot of Hudson River fish, and they are showing really interesting behaviors off Delaware. We thought they would jet through in their southern migration. They just wanted to go to North Carolina. That's kind of phenomenal. But it looks like we're part of that overwintering habitat off Delaware. And then the other part of this is when they come back out for spring. They are jetting through our array within a couple-day period, all of them. So it's just this very cool, directed behavior back to the Hudson River. It's really fun stuff. And we'll be presenting that work at the AFS meeting, which will be in Atlantic City this year. Or I'm happy to come back and talk about it when we finish the project. Thank you for your attention.
Questions?
Back to white perch for a minute. You pointed out the impacts of engagement. But those impacts have changed given the population of zebra mussels.
Yeah.
Different. So how is that impacted? Are you still seeing the same sort of changes that we saw earlier in the study?
Yeah. I actually had a slide that diminished stocks of zebra mussels, but you know, you can go back.
Yeah, you can go back.
There. Here they have diminished. And I guess the thought I had is this view of stable state theory that there's this path dependency, that the ecosystem shifted to a different state, low phytoplankton stocks, and increased sensitivity to flow. And even as you relieve the instigator of that abrupt change, it's much harder for the ecosystem to rebound to where it was previously. That's speculation, but that would be one view of this. And I think there hasn't been any demonstrable change in terms of, say, the zooplankton size distribution. I don't know that to be the case. I would ask Jay Strayer and others if that was the case, but I don't recall ever seeing anything like that associated with this. There's also been this other mussel invasion in 2008. I don't know how that figures into continued high grazing rates.
So they don't know if the quagga mussels are just taking the place of the zebra mussels, or are they?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Something must do.
Somebody must know that.
It's in the paper. It's probably just another speculation that there could be other things species taking place. Did that satisfy you? I mean, it's really just a question. Yeah, I just don't have sufficient knowledge base to really answer that. Dave, is there anything about this entire period of time, which the scientific community can learn something about how to respond to these things that happen, that we know got ready for this? Yes, you and others by getting some baseline data before the baseline disappeared. But did you, and sort of looking at gaps in data, are there things that you would advise the scientific community, the monitoring community, the national community to do when something occurs that looks like a change and you want to be able to really understand what happened? How do you have to get on top of it? How do you jump on it? Well, it's something we're dealing with the wind energy now, right? Yeah. Because we know, I mean, you just can't imagine the change that's going to go on in the shelf of these wind farms. Yeah. It's exciting, but it's so we have an opportunity to do things right in the United States that they didn't do right in Europe, which is to do the before part of this. And what was right here is we had that long-term data set that allowed us to get that before picture. Now, when we talk about before elements and experimental design, we talk about before after controlled impact. But that's moved to a different design called BAG, before after gradient design. And these are very powerful because what they can allow you to do is not only appreciate and capture the fact that many of our disturbances are gradients. Environmental parameter flow. That's a gradient effect that we're seeing. Zebra mussels probably is a gradient effect, where we have concentration effects in fresh water and it diminishes as you move away from it. So I think as you set up designs, you set it up with it in mind that you're not just trying to capture the impact in that one location, get from the little control site that you think is going to work here. But try to incorporate these environmental gradients. That gives you some assurance down the road that you can not only understand the impact of a disturbance, but also that you're learning more about the system. Gradient designs allow you to learn something about the natural processes that are driving the responses of interest. So that's what I would propose, that we build these kind of design elements. The utilities, I don't know if that's where you're going. I mean, they did that because they oversampled the river. That's another strategy. Maybe I shouldn't say that. But 1,000 samples, I mean, that gets you a really good inference. And so that you can measure these kinds of gradients and what they did. So you can hedge your bets in terms of what tanks have. What about the threat of the impacts? What about data that disappears unless collected during this period? Things are going on with other species. Yeah. Did you learn anything about what you might like to know about? Yeah, well, maybe you just wrote my next proposal. I think that there are studies that we have done that were supported by the foundation that would be great to revisit. And that would get you this before-after picture. I would, the eel work that we did, where we looked at gradients of abundance and growth rates in the Hudson River. That's a baseline that we can return to and look. If we have hypotheses that said, okay, we think that we have an invasive species that kill off part of the eels. We think that the flow rate is now having a bigger impact on the benthic environments that eels feed in. So I think the foundation itself, we want to look at some of the kinds of studies you've done in the past and whether they're worth revisiting to get these kinds of before-after pictures.
Dave, you've got a question up there.
Can I ask a question? I just want to know, these mussels are affected by antidepressants getting into the Hudson River, and it causes their behavior to change. And they become more, what we call they become more, non-defensible against their prey.
The zebra mussels?
Yes, I don't know, that's what I'm asking you.
Well,
Antidepressants getting into the water affect the,
yeah, I don't know how zebra mussels could become lesser or more vulnerable to predation. I think they're just there. I mean, either size, maybe growth. If you got growth.
those behavior.
But, yeah, I don't think, when we talk about mussels, I've not heard anything about antidepressants. You know, Judy?
The only behavior you could sort of measure in an adult bivalve would be, you know, they open or close their shells.
Yeah.
And that has been used, you know, filtration rate, opening and closing the valve. But,
That's what I was thinking, if it could come in terms of, you know, physiological costs, and that could impact things like growth. But, yeah. As you read it, we can read it back saying, we found disconnect between eggs and yolks. We think increased flow might be increasing advection of yolk sac larvae out of the south end of the larval retention area. So we're actually, in the recent time, we're seeing higher production of yolk sac larvae for the egg. And so the disconnect is one that Judy pointed out, that we're seeing compensation of higher yolk sac larval stocks than we would expect given egg abundance. So but, you know, effective flow out of the area is always a possibility. And we did see, you know, this is a different species, but you saw that for the striped bass, there was a high flow here. We saw striped bass that was down by numbers, and we would expect those fish to respond to that. You know, John, we did look at these kind of, well, we did a little bit. We did look at some event-driven flows. In 2014, we had some major storms in the summer. And we think it affected this dynamic it did affect the growth dynamics of juvenile white perch that we measured. But we didn't look at the effects of kind of acute flow events on, say, yolk sac larvae. We had a big nor'easter blow through in April or May. Yeah, you could get a major reduction of that. That might be something interesting to look at down the line in the utilities data, the year class reports will allow you to do that. We have that data. We certainly, you know, it's been digitized now, and we're happy to share it with anybody's interested in that further.
Do you want to speculate at all about future climate change issues for white perch, or if there will be issues for white perch?
Yeah, I think that the prediction is diminished production and potentially diminished ability to be resilient against that effect. The solution, if you're going to compensate for this, is to build production back into the system, which goes back to the idea of increased connectance with tributaries and littoral habitats. Because they've looked at fishing, and fishing just seems to be, although they're fish and it's hard to avoid them, but it's de minimis in terms of the mortality on adults. It just doesn't have that much. That's even true in Chesapeake.
With pending closure, what's the future status of the utility development surveys work?
You have a few hours after the meeting, we'll talk about it. They've stopped. And the question whether there's going to be funds to continue it. So there are people scrambling now looking for ways to continue it.
Is it expected to continue through the closure, or
I'm sorry.
Are the surveys going to continue through the date of the closure?
No, the Long River survey has been closed. The last one has been done. The Fall Shoals surveys are continuing. So I'm not sure till when, whether it's going to be till the 2021 or. So that ichthyoplanktton surveys that was the last one. This was the last one this year. critical time.
So Dave Strayer and I will not be revising each other's work from here on out. No, we just added to Dave's work. I don't think there's anything down that's very different.
Any other questions? And when are you coming back, did you say?
I love coming up here.
All right, thanks, Dave.